Hello, my name is Esmeralda Bogosian, and I am the Senior Data and Impact Manager with Teach For Armenia. Today I have a pleasure to have this conversation with Dr. Noelle Griffin. She is the Senior Associate Director at National Center for Research on Evaluation Standards and Student Testing, CRESST in short. CRESST has conducted a external program evaluation for Teach For Armenia, for Teach For Armenia's core program, 2 years teacher leadership program, and today we will discuss the results and their implications. Hi Noelle, can you give us a brief, high-level overview of the evaluation's purpose and design? What were the main research questions you set out to answer?
Sure, and thank you for having me join you. Our broadest goal of the evaluation was to determine whether the program improves teacher practice, student leadership, and student academic outcomes. So we used a quasi-experimental design. So what that is where you take a group of students and teachers who are participating in a program and compare them to a group of teachers and students who aren't participating in the program. Now, the gold standard for evaluation is something called randomized control, which is where teachers and students would be randomly assigned to one group or the other. That's, as you can imagine, in education, very difficult to achieve. So the second highest rigorous approach to evaluation is this quasi-experimental approach that we've discussed. And it's the approach used by a large percentage of federal evaluations in the United States. So although what we call non-random assignments, so teachers are self-selecting to participate in the program or not, leaves some room for what we call selection bias. So that's where more motivated teachers are opting, let's say, to be in the program. But matching the schools and teachers, including background variables in the analysis and controlling for those, are ways that we address and control for these differences. So it's a very rigorous and empirically sound approach to these types of evaluations. The main research questions that we approached in this study: one, does participation in the Teach for Armenia model raise student leadership, career efficacy, social emotional skills, and several key subconstructs or smaller skills in those particular areas. Second, how does participation impact classroom practices of teachers? So project-based learning, universal design for learning, providing a safe learning environment. And third, what is the impact of the program on core student academic performance across primary and secondary grades? And for this study, we focused in on mathematics content and Armenian language content.
Thank you, Dr. Noelle, for providing this overview on the research question and methods. You mentioned that one of the first research questions was about the student leadership. And let's speak about the student leadership survey and what were the results that stood out. What stood out most to you in student leadership and career efficacy surveys for younger students? And when we say younger students, those are students from grade 3 to 6, versus older students, and those students are from grade 7 to 12.
Sure, and thank you for noting we did develop a survey to collect information about these sort of constructs, student leadership and career efficacy, using surveys that we developed in the past, but also tailoring it to the unique focus of the Teach for Armenia program. So in the younger cohort, we found that Teach for Armenia students outperformed students who weren't participating in the program on constructs such as building relationships, co-creating a shared vision, co-creating action plans, taking collective actions, and reflecting and growing. So that is, they reported higher confidence in areas focused on personal growth, emotional regulation, and community change agency, all which are key foci of your program. For the older students, so grades 7 through 12, the gains that we saw for the participants compared to the non-participants were mostly in relationship building, vision co-creation, and also a little bit in reflect and grow. So students focused more and showed more of a clearer sense of navigating the existing systems, investigating and articulating the community needs. The magnitude or the significance of change was slightly smaller at the upper grades than the lower grades, but not to a level where it really is something hugely of note.
These are very interesting insights, and going deeper, the data show more substantial gains in relationship building, vision co-creation, and reflective growth among intervention students. How do you interpret these results and in terms of programs' impact on leadership development?
Sure. And again, these were areas where we anticipated seeing differences because these were the areas that your program was really focusing in on. So the pattern suggests that the program is especially effective at early stage leadership skills with your younger students. So things like, relationship building, goal setting, reflection. For the older students, the focus shifts a little bit towards strategic engagement with existing community structures, which makes sense. It's sort of a natural developmental progression that's suggested by the curriculum and the path that the teachers follow with these students, rather than something that, would be unexpected.
Yeah, thank you for providing this overview on student leadership. And moving forward, let's speak about academic progress. It's always tough to speak about the academic progress in all learning contexts. During this evaluation, the evaluation targeted two core subjects, mathematics and the Armenian language. And in mathematics and the Armenian language, we observe mixed patterns. Some differences in math in the 7th grade, but variable performance in higher grades, especially in the tasks that have application-oriented and critical thinking orientations. What do you think drives those differences among the students' results in maths and Armenian language?
Well, first off, I think when we start to talk about student academic outcomes, generally in evaluation, these are what we call trailing indicators. So as evaluators, we don't necessarily expect to see these sort of impacts across the board in the earlier phases of implementation. Like let's say after 1 year, sometimes it's 2 or 3 years. It's more of what we call a trailing indicator versus a leading indicator, which would be some of the things that you might see earlier as we were talking about with the student leadership and efficacy. With that in mind, so for math, the younger grades showed no change overall and within items, but at grade 7, there was a higher overall scores in the algebra area with a clear advantage in subcomponents such as critical thinking and application-oriented items. Now, for Armenian language, we saw strong gains overall for the intervention students in grades 5 and 8. Grade 5 made gains on knowledge-based and application-oriented tasks. And upper grades, there was a little change in the scores in the application-oriented and critical thinking categories. So, we saw some gains, not across the board, but enough to be meaningful and to consider that a success of the program in those areas. Now, why are the patterns mixed? Why aren't you seeing across the board changes at every grade? Well, some of the reasons I mentioned having to do with this being more of a trailing indicator. Also, there's some other issues to consider, like curriculum alignment. So the early grade curricula emphasizes foundational skills that map particularly well to the focus of Teach For Armenia with hands-on, inquiry-driven learning and practices. Also, we need to take into account cognitive load. So upper grade tasks demand higher order reasoning, which is a skill that not all students will bring into the classroom in the upper grades. So the PBL focus that Teach For Armenia has with its teachers may need to provide some stronger scaffolding for this sort of abstract problem solving and higher order reasoning skills. Also, instructional fidelity. So keep in mind, teachers have a lot that they have to cover during the year. And at the end of the year, there's sort of a push in what teachers are trying to achieve and get done. So that may limit the amount of time teachers have at that point to provide differentiated support for these sort of complex tasks, especially in the older grade. So those are things to think about. We don't know for sure what is causing, the fact that there wasn't across the board change, that it was in certain grades and not others. But these are some things to consider that could have been influencing those outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for this overview. It's always important to hear the evaluators' interpretation on the academic results, because different audience have different interpretation of the results, and but the overview provided by the evaluators that conducted the research is very important and it is essential. Thank you for this information. And moving forward to the next key findings, let's speak about classroom practices. Observations indicate that intervention classrooms spend more time on group work and hands-on activities, which was very predictable. And while comparison classrooms leaned more on explicit lecture-based instructions. How should we read this trade-off in terms of student engagement versus content coverage?
Well, as you said, this was a finding that we had expected, that we had hypothesized we were going to see in the data, because the Teach for Armenia program, the intervention classrooms are focused on devoting time to collaborative, hands-on activities and integrating those into the classroom and linking those lessons to the students' lived experiences and day-to-day life. So we're not surprised that we saw more of those types of activities in the Teach for Armenia classrooms versus the comparative classrooms, which relied on more traditional lecture-based instructions, visual aids, the type of things that teachers would typically do. So none of this was surprising. Of course, there's always a little bit of a trade-off that you're going to find greater engagement and autonomy amongst your students in intervention settings. This can boost motivations and relational skills, which of course we saw in the student survey. Lecture-heavy environments might preserve some content coverage and the depth of content coverage, but you lose that engagement and motivation. So there's always a challenge of blending the two to improve student achievement and mastery, and integrating the lecture and the lecture and those types of activities with the more integrated participatory activities. And that's a skill in its own. So on one hand, you're helping teachers to learn these new skills, with PBL and UDL. At the same time, it's how do I integrate that with things I've already learned how to do? And that's a skill on its own. So that can take some additional time to sort of bring those two together.
My next question is again about teaching practices and two practices. Project-based learning, which is widely used in Teach for Armenia. We use the terminology change-based learning, but for the larger audience, we replace the term project-based learning, which is widely known, and universal design for learning. Teachers reported greater use of project-based learning and universal design for learning early in the year, in the diagnostic phase. But UDL practices waned by spring, in the summative phase. What factors contributed to this decline, in your opinion, and how we can sustain inclusive practices for the longer term?
So the biggest contributing factor, in my opinion, that I would hypothesize, and based on the data we collected and previous work that we've done, we talked a little bit about before, which is teacher workloads tend to peak later in the year. Teachers have a lot, suddenly they find themselves with a lot of things they have to catch up on, and that makes it harder to cover and integrate some of these new practices when they're just pushing to get through everything they need to get through at the end of the year. Also, there can be implementation fatigue. So they've been really working hard to implement these new practices. It's something new to them. It takes effort. And at a certain point, they might feel a little overwhelmed and worn down. Also, sometimes coaching tends to wane a little bit in the later part of the year again, because coaches get busy. They've got things they have to handle in their classrooms. So these are all things, of course, we don't know for sure that these were the contributing factors, but they tend to be the types of things that we've seen in other evaluations. Also, in your region, some students were arriving at schools from conflict areas. Trauma can affect their experience in the classroom, how teachers interact with them. So that's, a variable that's waxing and waning over the year as well, and something that needs to be considered. So some things to think about to sustain these activities. One idea would be to be embedding UDL checkpoints into the lesson plan. So in other words, here's where you're going to check in, see how the kids are doing, use that information to adjust your instruction, providing what we could call micro coaching. So smaller coaching activities that are targeted, especially towards the end of the year. And another thing to think about is at individual schools, aligning the UDL metrics with the school-wide evaluation dashboard so that, the teachers really, the things that they have to focus on at the end of the year are connected in their mind to their UDL practices. So those are some things to think about moving forward that maybe could improve sustaining the high level of engagement towards the end of the year, which is always difficult with these types of professional development programs.
Yeah, this is so true. My next question is about the takeaways. Based on the evidence and the report that you have provided to us, what were the three most important takeaways for teachers who want to replicate the successes of intervention schools, the schools that are part of Teach for Armenia program?
Right, thank you. And, this comes from the survey data we talked about, also from interviews that were done with teachers, finding out a little bit about what they did in the classroom and how things worked for them. So one is to prioritize collaborative work, particularly structured collaborative work. So making sure that there's set aside time for students to work on group projects, connecting it to real world contexts, and keeping it as a structured part of the lesson and not sort of a off, off to the side activity. The second is to blend active learning with purposeful direct instruction, so more lecture type instruction. So use more focused, short mini lectures to introduce concepts and then move on to the hands-on application. So ways to kind of, as we were talking about, integrate those two types of instruction. Another, which I alluded to, is embedding ongoing UDL mini checks. So weekly check-ins with the students, reflecting on the lesson, reflecting on student outcomes, engagement, expression. These don't have to be formal assessments, but these can just be little check-ins with the students, with student groups, even the teacher and the coach doing a little bit of reflection about the process. But not letting it go, all right, now we're at the end of the lesson, what happened? But really, each week building in some scheduled time to really think about how things are progressing.
Yeah, thank you. Our historical data, internal data, the internal assessment keeps us showing that we have challenges with critical thinking development, and it's not a unique challenge within Teach for Armenia. It's a, I think, national challenge at the national educational level, and the external evaluation came to prove it. Given the challenges observed in upper grade, application-oriented and critical thinking tasks, what adjustment do you recommend for curriculum or pedagogy at those grade levels?
Sure. So based on both our study and some of what we see in the literature on teacher instruction and professional development, Some ideas to think about. One is to support guided inquiry scaffolding. So activities like think, pair, share, using graphic organizers, things that can kind of bridge and scaffold more basic foundational knowledge to higher order thinking and higher order tasks. And really think of ways that those could be strategically built into the curriculum. The second, strengthen metacognitive coaching. So basically coaching students on learning how to learn and thinking about their learning. So reflection journals, using self-assessment and really thinking about what am I learning? How am I learning? And this helps build some of those critical thinking habits that you are hoping to build in these students. The third thing to think about would be aligning the PBL milestones with more explicit standards for student and teachers. So like we talked about, having some targeted assessments throughout the year, and they don't have to be large or long, but ways to kind of check in, see how things are doing, and having that little more rigorous assessment built into the process. Not just, and as part of that, how to use teaching teachers how to use the assessments, which that's, a huge part of assessment. It's not just data, it's, well, how do you use that information to be meaningful in the classroom? So those are some things to think about as you look to continue to build and develop the Teach for Armenia program.
Those recommendations on developing critical thinking habits are very essential. We have tried a lot of strategies, and each year we introduce new strategies, and we try new practices. We learn from data and assessments, and those recommendations will be definitely embedded in our core program. My next question is about implementation survey results. Giving more context, implementation survey was about the teaching practices that are applied at school. How can school leaders use the implementation survey results to prioritize professional development investments when it comes to teacher development, teacher professional development? For example, deeper PBL coaching or sustained universal design support, etc.
Right. And again, these are just suggestions and things to
Yes.
consider based on both the data and on best practices in these fields. So obviously the deep dive PBL coaching is going to be really important. Perhaps multi-day workshops, or, if not half-day workshops, providing classroom walkthroughs, and also aligning outcomes and milestones with curricular standards. So if teachers can really see how these PBL activities are linking up to the curriculum, are linking to outcomes, that really helps enrich the activities, both for the teachers and for the students. Second, sustained UDL mentorship. We talked about the mentorship and how, potentially, because people get busy, it can sort of wane over time. Making sure that that mentorship is sustained and targeted. So, thinking strategically about who you pair, what Novus teachers and UDL experts you're pairing together. Embed sessions to review and differentiate lesson plans in the schedule so that there's really time set aside for this mentoring work, which is, it is an additional task both for the coach and for the mentee. So finally, social emotional learning. Thinking about restorative practices and how support for social learning and restorative practices can be built into the professional development. Integrating evidence-based social emotional learning frameworks, things like restorative circles, integrating those into staff onboarding process, and also integrating it into the ongoing professional development. Because again, with, all of the things that teachers have to cover, all of the work that they do, some of these areas can sort of get pushed to the side later in the year. So making sure there's some sustained support and follow-up for this focus, I think could be really effective and have a real impact.
Dr. Noelle, it was my pleasure to have this conversation with you, and thanks for answering those questions in this detail. Let's end with what do you find to be the bottom line takeaway from the evaluation? What is the main conclusion that we can have from this external evaluation study that lasted probably almost 2 years?
Great. Thank you. And thank you for both inviting me to talk about this work and also for inviting us to work with your team. It really has been a pleasure to conduct this evaluation. So the bottom line in all of this is that we did find evidence that the program is having impact. We saw significant changes for the participants, students, and teachers in a range of different outcomes, not necessarily every outcome we looked at, but again, that's not going to be expected, especially at this stage of this type of study. You know, when we looked at, as you said, it was a 2-year study where there were maybe 18 months of data collection. So, you know, we did find the evidence we had hypothesized we would find that the program is effective and is having impact. Student social emotional outcomes, student learning outcomes, and teacher practices all showed some of this evidence. And in other words, this is what we would hope to see for the first year of implementation for teachers who are participating in a program such as Teach For Armenia. This is the best, you know, sort of the best case scenario, if you will. And as teachers continue to implement these practices and as students to continue to progress in classrooms that implement these practices, we hope that over time we'll be able to see more changes, longer term impacts. And those are the types of things that can be tracked over time in a more what we call longitudinal study, which could be, you know, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. But overall, you know, I think we found the evidence we were thinking we might find. You know, the evidence lines up with the goals of your program. And we're looking forward to see how things develop in the long term.
Yeah, thank you for this conversation. I strongly believe that this study will be part of the more longitudinal research project that might appear and cornerstone for partnership between UCLA and Teach For Armenia in longer terms. These insights will be very helpful for our different stakeholders, for our students, teachers, alumni, and those experts that are very interested in educational matters. And thank you for this conversation and for your time. I wish you well and see you soon.
Same to you. Thank you.